to this episode of Arts in Conversation. My name is Diane Collin. I am a woman with short hair, blue eyes, and glasses, and today I wear a black and white striped top. Behind me are an electronic piano and white shelves with books. This series presents artists, academics, and project leaders who dedicate their time and energy to a better accessibility for people with disabilities in the arts. You can find more of these conversations on our website, artsably.com, which is spelled artsably.com. Today, Artsably is in conversation with Dr. Stefan Sunandan Honish, a sessional instructor in the Department of Theatre and Film at the University of British Columbia, exploring the intersectional fields of disability studies, music, and pedagogy. You can find the resources mentioned by Dr. Sunandan Honish during this episode on Artsably's website in the blog section. thank you very much, Stefan, for being here today.
My
Uh,
pleasure.
so I am with Stefan Sunandan Honish, and he is a sessional instructor at the Department of Theatre and Film at the University of British Columbia. And I think your research interests are at the intersection of critical disability studies, music, and also critical pedagogy, right?
Yes, yeah.
Thank you. So I will ask you to present yourself and also provide visual descriptions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Diane. It's good to be with you. I'll also maybe just add that my research and teaching has, within the last several years, also expanded to include theater studies. At the moment, I'm teaching a course on dramaturgy in my department. So as far as a visual description, I'm bald and I have a short beard. Uh, the hairs that I still have is dark brown. Um, and I have glasses that are dark blue with dark blue and black rims. Today I'm wearing a dark gray checker patterned scarf and a black full sleeved sweater and a blue and red patterned shirt, dark blue and red patterned shirt.
Thank you. Okay, so I know that in UBC you're also doing a lot of different kind of research, but you're also a pianist, and I wanted to ask you about your background, everything that came before you became a professor at UBC.
Okay. Thanks very much, Diane. And also, uh, thank you for the opportunity to discuss my background in piano. This is an aspect of my uh, experience that has certainly stayed with me all these years. So I began piano lessons at the age of 7. It's I don't know whether this is a common experience of getting older, but I find it easier to remember things that happened, 30 plus years ago, sometimes than to remember what happened last week or yesterday. And the reason I preface with that is I still remember quite vividly seeing a piano recital on television. It was on CBC television. It was the pianist Angela Hewitt. And uh, I think I started pestering my parents pretty soon thereafter uh, for piano lessons. And I remember also very vividly coming home. My sister and I came home from school. We would have been, I would have been, I think, 6 or 7, and my sister 1 year younger than me. And I heard the sound of a piano, and it was coming from my room at my parents' home, and my dad was seated at the piano and just uh, playing a few notes. And so the piano has been a continual presence ever since uh, in my life, in my research, in my teaching, and um, just uh, even if I'm not thinking about uh, uh, the piano and piano playing for research or teaching on a given day or in a given week, um, there's the piano is I risk sort of veering into sentimentality here, but again, maybe there's nothing wrong with being sentimental after a certain age. So the piano for me is a friend, a companion. And so just having the piano as this constant presence in my life is something that I treasure, and I have my parents to thank for that and for everything else. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, there is nothing wrong about being sentimental in any age
Yeah.
possible.
Right. Yeah.
So you started piano lessons and you developed some piano skills, but when did you go from the pianist to being interested in anything about um, I would say disability studies, which is today, but maybe in the years you started exploring that, it was not called disability studies, it was called something else. Or it was not developed yet, or something like that. So can you explain how you switched from the pianist to the researcher, basically?
Okay. Thanks very much, Diane. That's a really interesting question and an important question. I think that in terms of my own experience, there wasn't um, an abrupt modulation, if you'll forgive the somewhat overwrought musical metaphor. There wasn't an abrupt modulation there. I'm going to repeat the overall metaphor. From being a student of the piano to being a researcher of disability and music performance, or disability and piano performance. When I became aware of disability studies, this was towards the end of my master's studies in piano performance and composition at the University of British Columbia. My sister sent me an article by Joseph Strauss, one of the first uh, publications in the now flourishing field of music and disability studies. And I managed to do a directed studies program in the School of Music with Professor Rena Sharon, and also the support of Professor Jane Coop, uh, uh, both of whom I studied with for the course of my master's program. And because I wanted to explore possible applications of disability studies in piano performance. And in piano pedagogy as well. And so that marked maybe a gentle kind of um, transition into from thinking about the piano as a music student at the time to thinking about the kinds of research questions I might ask about being a disabled pianist. And again, to some extent, this might be a common experience for at least some disabled scholars and disabled musicians. As I read more throughout the course of my graduate work and began to learn more about disability studies and certainly about learning as I began to learn more about critical approaches in disability studies, um, I came to an awareness, I suppose, retrospectively, in some sense, uh, that I had spent my life up to that point trying as much as possible to be less disabled, or to try to be as not disabled as possible. And becoming aware of disability studies as a field about disability activism and so forth, highlighted for me that it's actually possible to not only to accept being disabled as a part of one's identity, but to find meaning, richness not in the capitalist uh, sense of wealth acquisition, but richness, nuance, skill, delicacy, beauty of one kind or another in being disabled. And so that all just to say that for me, there's been a kind of recursive quality, if I could frame it that way, from studying the piano, thinking about the piano, at one point having aspirations to be a professional pianist, on one hand, and then making a fairly smooth transition, not without its bumps, but relatively smooth, from doing studying the piano as an aspiring pianist to moving into research and teaching within the the capacious umbrella of disability studies.
I see.
Yeah.
And so the book that you were mentioning, the article that you were mentioning, it then became a book, right? It was Extraordinary Measures
Right,
from Joseph Strauss, yes.
right,
So yeah, well, you're right. One of the first, like the first,
right,
really literary exploration of the intersection between the critical disability studies field and the musical field. And
right.
then many followed, but that was really one of the really interesting first exploration.
Right.
So this was your master, and then you did a PhD too,
I
right?
did. Yes.
And it followed the same exploration, or did you? I know you did a postdoctoral research about Helen Keller,
Right.
but did this was already in your mind when you were doing your master and your PhD, or how did you segued from what you were researching to Helen Keller?
Right. So, uh, if I could just maybe begin with my PhD studies, because when you were introducing me earlier, you noted that my research interests encompass critical pedagogy. So the move into the education department was, in some sense, unexpected, but certainly productive in various ways. And uh, so over the course of my PhD studies and working on my dissertation and so forth, I had the opportunity to think about music from the outside, as it were, from the perspective of critical approaches in education studies, in educational research that um, uh, have taken on that have taken on perspectives and methodologies and theoretical insights from cultural studies, for example, to uh, forward critiques of what's often called Western art music or Western classical music, all of which are problematic and misleading descriptors. To So cultural studies approaches or sociological approaches in education, critical pedagogy as a distinct area within education, for example, all um, share a concern with the ways in which traditions such as those associated with the kinds of formal music pedagogy uh, of colleges and conservatories, universities in North America and Europe, uh, say, both historically and into the present, have been um, uh, have participated in various ways in colonizing approaches to how we think about music. And um, one um, one complication for some of these cultural studies critiques, of course, is that in recent years, in the last several decades, let's say, because of the the new musicology, and because of the entry of critical approaches in music studies, some of the critiques from within education studies, informed by cultural studies, by sociology, by critical pedagogy approaches. Some of those critiques need updating and refinement. Um, and we can talk more if there's opportunity within the scope of today's conversation about my how my first book project grew out of my dissertation research. With respect to the question of Helen Keller, I'll I'll say maybe two things about my postdoctoral research that might be relevant. So, Helen Keller has long fascinated me for various reasons. Um, not not because of the conventional and not only familiar but overly familiar stories and tropes really associated with her life, but because of her writing. Uh, so what drew me first to Helen Keller's work is her writing, just how she writes. Um, I happened upon a few excerpts from some of her writing, uh, and I was immediately drawn to her writing style. And as I began reading her some of her other writings in her books, and thanks to my parents and sister, I now have a wonderful collection of um, work by Helen Keller, including a first edition of one of her books that my parents and sister went through uh, quite some effort to obtain for me. And it's one of my uh, uh, treasured books. So I also, as I read more of her work, I became interested in her activism, in her writings about politics, her support for workers and so forth, and then also, in all honesty, the contested aspects of her life and work, her highly problematic and rightly criticized support for eugenics, and it is one example. Her support for what I believe are known as sheltered workshops, which exist to this day, as far as I understand, and there are ongoing efforts to ensure that, or to recognize that the work that disabled people do in the workforce should be fairly compensated at the very least. So all of those aspects of Helen Keller's life and work, the admirable work that she did, and the not so admirable thinking that comes across in some of her work as well, make her somebody really uh, of enduring importance, I would say, as with so many great thinkers, so many important, so many public figures whose work remains of value in really lasting ways. I think the very fact that not everything she wrote or not everything she said or thought is admirable or fair-minded or in some cases not everything that she wrote is principled. I think it's precisely that complexity and that those moments of ambiguity and in her struggle, to find and articulate an egalitarian politics. I think there are many questions that we can continue to ask about Helen Keller's work, and I think that's precisely what one of the things that I find of such sustained interest for me in thinking about Keller's life and work. And just as an aside, I that's what prompted me to apply for the Banting postdoctoral fellowship program. And during the course of my research, I unexpectedly came across this poem by Helen Keller, and that remains beyond my postdoc. That remains a second key focus of the project that I'm working on. There's a poem that Keller wrote called "A Chant of Darkness," and it's been set to music twice, at least that I'm aware of, including in a setting by the Italian-American composer Cesare Sodero, in an Italian translation, Canto dall'Oscurità. And what I've been hoping to do through with Banting funding, I was able to hire a graduate student to help me with transcribing the manuscript, full score and parts. And one thing that I'm hoping to do, and this remains an ongoing project, is to have this music performed. I am not aware of any existing recordings. I've had some initial conversations with the New York Public Library Performing Arts Division, and they've been immensely helpful, and they've expressed initial interest in if I'm able to have this music performed and recorded. They've expressed interest in having a recording for their collections of this music. And so far as I'm aware, there is no recording of this work, and there's no published edition of this music. And the reception of Keller's poem, the circumstances in which she wrote the poem, and how she thought of this work, and its relation then to Sodero's setting for voice and orchestra, I think offers much to work with, both from a pedagogical standpoint and then also in terms of research.
Very good. I was just going to ask you the setting of that. You told me it was voice and orchestra. Very interesting. I didn't know at all. Okay. And so that's your Helen Keller work. Are you going to publish something about this work?
I'm hoping, certainly I've been working on developing my research on Helen Keller into published form. I because I'm a sessional lecturer, I'm doing contract-based work. So and I have my first book under contract, which is a priority. And opportunities come along the way as well. So all of that just to say that it's certainly a priority for me to take the exploratory work that I did during the course of my uh, uh, postdoctoral research and develop these explorations. I did some conference presentations and so forth. And I'd like to develop this more fully into longer publications and so forth, certainly.
So speaking of projects that you have, your book,
Yeah,
can you talk about it?
sure. Thanks, Diane. So my book is under contract with the University of Michigan Press, and this grows out of my doctoral research, and as with uh, I guess many first book projects, it both uh, starts from the dissertation, but also uh, moves beyond the scope of a dissertation. So I became aware of the pianist Nobuyuki Tsuji during the course of my doctoral research, and the timing was fortuitous in the sense that this was right around the time that I was thinking about my dissertation topic. And when I found out that Nobuyuki Tsuji shared the gold medal at the 2009 Van Cliburn competition, and that his blindness constituted a key focus, uh, almost to the point of obsession at times in the press reception of the 2009 Cliburn competition. I I it became clear to me that I wanted to pursue this. The questions raised about disabled pianists and piano competitions, the sort of political economy of musical life, as it were. Um, and because of where I live and have lived almost continuously with a 2 year pause in between at St. John's College, which is a residential college on the campus of of the University of British Columbia, the Point Grey campus. Because of where I live, there's a strong emphasis on informal and non-formal educational events. So I was able to work with the college staff and faculty and fellow residents at the time. This was in 2013 to bring Nobuyuki Tsuji to the University of British Columbia for a solo recital. He also participated in a question and answer session, and this was all by that point 3 or 4 years after his Cliburn victory. And I had the chance to meet with Nobu, as he likes to be called, and also Nick Asano, who was traveling with him at the time as an assistant and manager. And I've stayed in touch with both of them throughout the years. And I interviewed Nobuyuki Tsuji for my dissertation. And the questions that I explore about what it means to be a pianist, what it means to be marked as a blind pianist in Nobuyuki Tsuji's case, and to resist that label. That has also helped me the the book project, which explores discourses of virtuosity and disability uh, from within a larger framework connected to discourses of vulnerability. Um, and so the planned title for this book project is Vulnerable Virtuosities, Disability in Concert and Competition. And I was briefly at Uppsala University for postdoctoral research in 2018, part of a research unit that explores vulnerability, not as a synonym for weakness and helplessness and dependency, but as a productive way of being in the world that makes a number of ethical and aesthetic demands, that raises questions about ethical interactions. And uh, I've also been influenced in a sustained way by the work of Julieta Singh, uh, who in a 2017 book develops the concept of vulnerable reading as an interdisciplinary and improvisatory approach to interdisciplinary engagement. And so that idea of interdisciplinarity, of improvisation in one's approach to engaging with a variety of texts that informs the approach that I'm hoping to take in the full length book manuscript.
Did you have the opportunity of finding other blind pianists and Nobu and discuss the differences and if they were able to participate in piano competitions and how it affected maybe their career, maybe their way of learning, things like that?
Yes. That's a really great question, Diane. So when I first began exploring this topic as a doctoral candidate, I reached out to librarians through a number of university library listservs and so forth. And uh, with respect to blind pianists, the names of pianists who come from the world of jazz and popular musical idioms, those were frequent recommendations. My my interest was and has remained, perhaps because of my own training and background and experience, my interest has remained more firmly within, I guess, what's called the classical music world. And so I've been able to find a number of historical examples uh, uh, and examples going, I would say, as far back as Maria Theresia Paradis, who I believe studied with Mozart, and was favorably reviewed by Charles Burney and others. And the historical example of Paradis and her life and work brings into the exploration questions of gender, how gender and disability intersect in terms of lived experience and professional activities and professional opportunities, and then also, of course, in terms of critical and popular reception. So one of the sort of unifying threads, if I can phrase it that way, in these various case studies that I'm exploring for the book, has to do with the juxtaposition or the friction very often between lived experience of disability, lived experience as a disabled pianist, for example, and then the kinds of discourses that are mobilized in critical and popular reception, very often replete with cliches about blindness. But then also critical and popular reception documents and texts certainly can offer something much more interesting than cliches and tropes. So all of that is I think worth thinking through and thinking with. And just apropos or in relation to my book project, if I can mention one other activity connected, a fairly recent activity connected to my book, which I was able to organize. This was during the first lockdowns after the WHO declared the COVID pandemic. So a lot of activities, research activities, and so forth were moving online. So with the support of a seed grant from the Interdisciplinary Histories Research Cluster at UBC, I was able to bring Deborah Saylor, a pianist and teacher and singer based in the US, to join UBC via Zoom for a guest lecture on her work and on her own success in the Van Cliburn competition for outstanding amateurs. And encountering Deborah Saylor's playing and how she thinks and talks about music has provided an expanded sense of possibility in terms of my own thinking about the meeting of vulnerability and virtuosity in performance. So that workshop, which was recorded on Zoom, is one of the case studies, as it were, that I explore for my book. A number of recommendations also came from librarians at various universities who directed me to published research that doesn't necessarily focus on high profile blind pianists or disabled musicians, but instead is based on empirical research involving case studies, participant observation with disabled musicians who don't necessarily maintain an international performing career, but who are very active in community music settings and so forth. And again, if there's time, this this latter connection between the work that disabled musicians do and community spaces and so forth that don't have the visibility really of international piano competitions or of the international concert circuit. This has become an important aspect of my work because of my participation in some SSHRC-funded projects that I was invited to join towards the end of my postdoc. There was one resource which a UBC music librarian pointed me to is a printed general reference source, Piano in Concert. I think it was published in 1982. And I was able to find short entries for historical examples of a number of blind pianists. And because my specific interest at that time was blind pianists. I wanted to find examples of other blind pianists who had participated in international piano competitions. My initial search was in narrowed in some way to specifically blind pianists, and more specifically in concerts and competition life. And so I became aware within the first couple of years of um, uh, 6 or 7 pianists in particular who, in some cases, um, had passed away several decades previously, and there are some examples of younger pianists who are still active. The French pianist Bernard Dascoli, for example, and I also reached out to there's a wonderful reference on piano competition specifically. So I reached out to the Arlenk and Argerich Foundation, and I corresponded briefly with Dr. Gustav Arlenk, who was most helpful in directing me to not only specific entries that I might otherwise have not realized uh, included blind pianists who won distinction or who achieved distinction in a given competition in a given year, but then also he um, uh, directed me to uh, magazines and newspapers in European contexts that I might also have not been aware of. So all of that just to say that because of my own specific interests that I in some sense narrowed down relatively quickly, I was able to find specific examples of blind pianists active as teachers, as concert pianists, and as jurors. One pianist I'm particularly interested in is Alberto Mozzati, um, who, as far as I know, didn't himself. I think he competed in 1 or 2 competitions and achieved some success, but he was uh, quite active as a juror at competitions, and then also he uh, produced a number of just really wonderful recordings of music by Chopin and other composers, and uh, YouTube has become just a really fantastic resource in many ways because it means that a great many recordings and live performances that might otherwise be uh, difficult to access are readily available. Because of my disability, it's not possible for me to travel extensively around Europe, for example, or for that matter, around North America to dig up archival materials and so forth. So having a number of resources available, open access, or relatively easy to access, makes a huge difference for my research.
So what about this section that is covered by SSHRC that you just mentioned? Can you talk about that?
You and I've also collaborated and been involved in some of the same events through these SSHRC-funded projects. So towards the end of my postdoc, I received an email from Adam Bell, who's now at Western University as a Canada Research Chair. And Adam invited me to join these SSHRC-funded projects that he was working on, and these have to do with disability in educational settings, in community settings, So there's the Canadian Accessible Musical Instruments Network, or CANON, that's the acronym, and I'm a co-applicant in that project. And so this and my participation in both is made possible by through the support of St. John's College, which is supporting my participation in both uh, uh, of these projects, because I don't have a permanent academic appointment. So uh, um, being able to live and work at St. John's College provides me with the scope that I uh, and the kinds of resources that support my participation in these projects. The second SSHRC funded project is connected to the first, and this is something that Adam invited me to work with him on as a co-director. So this is the SSHRC Race, Gender, Diversity Initiative project, facilitating anti-ableist remote music making, or the acronym sounds like FARM, FAARM. And the common thread between both of these projects has to do with the work and the knowledge and the skills of disabled musicians working in a range of settings and contexts, including in the community, in online and hybrid formats, and both projects support the exploration of design work led by disabled people to create opportunities for designing instruments and ways of making music that are accessible in ways that familiar instruments often aren't. Um, and then also opportunities for collaboration, for music making, for thinking and researching music in online and hybrid formats that also support increased participation by disabled people, because in so many ways, strictly in-person events can present any number of obstacles to the participation of disabled people.
And these are important projects because there is such a lack of the presence of these projects in our field.
Right.
And we know of projects that have a specific aim and then it ends, such as conferences or such as symposiums that are really great because that's where we meet each other.
Right.
But there is a struggle of continuing the work after that. So thank you for being part of these projects. It's really important.
Thank you so much, Diane. And I also want to echo your thanks and offer my thanks to you for the work that you're doing. Uh, Most recently, your presentation on Arts Ably for St. John's College, and the work that you're leading to create opportunities and bring increased awareness of the work that we're all doing as disabled colleagues, as musical colleagues, uh, and, uh, and the ways in which being disabled musicians also connects us in these networks of collegiality and collaboration. I'm most grateful to you for the work that you're leading.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I have a question that I like to ask. It's about the meaning of working in arts and promoting accessibility.
Okay.
And I like to ask people, what is your What does it mean for you to work in a field of accessibility in the arts?
I really love this question. It's not one that is necessarily easy to answer, and I think that's one of the reasons I really like it. So for me, working on access, trying to support access to uh, come to increased awareness of my own access needs, and learn and to learn how to support the access needs of colleagues, friends, and uh, students in a range of learning environments, professional environments, and so forth. What that means for me is attending to the ways in which uh, the disability study, the disability justice principle of collective access offers a particularly bright guiding star, as it were, but also the recognition that uh, thinking at all times about possible ways in which access needs of different people might be in tension with one another. And further, and at the same time, recognizing that when faced with the uh, reality or prospect of conflicting or incongruous access needs of different people in a given context, the responsibility is not to, as is unfortunately done far too often, to try to establish a hierarchy of which access needs are more important. This is the sort of neoliberal way, uh, um, and it has to do with so many aspects of this sort of rhetoric of scarce resources, which is in many ways manufactured. The resources aren't scarce. The way the economy is organized makes it really well nigh impossible for so many people to get the kinds of support that they need. Um, and I mention all of this because the responsibility for those of us who work on accessibility in the arts and on supporting access uh, in hopefully transformative ways, the responsibility is always to figure out how to work with individuals in ways that support all access needs as fully and as ethically and as responsibly as we are capable of doing without um, uh, not only without giving credence to the neoliberal hierarchies and sort of tokenistic approaches to, reasonable accommodation and so forth. Not only refusing to give credence to those harmful discourses and practices, but also um, to show what we are offering that is an alternative, a genuinely inclusive, ethical, and uh, dialogical and solidaristic approach to access.
Yes, makes sense. And it's really we everybody has a different access need.
Right.
So this is also something that to have a broader openness on access needs and accessibility in general is something that is coming more and more, but still not here fully.
Right.
And so yeah, that's really important.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diane.
So I have a last question before we
Sure.
conclude our conversation, which is about inspiration or about someone that you would envision or think of when you're thinking of your own work, someone who maybe have guided you to where you are today, or just someone that you admire. Who would that person be?
Thanks for the question. I the two people I think of right away are my parents. Um, and uh their example they're examples of generosity, of kindness, compassion, hospitality, um, and I know they might be amused by this in some way if they hear this part of my response, but my my own commitment to egalitarianism, to egalitarian politics, to critiques of um, the to the practices of capitalism. Uh, all of this uh, is inspired by my parents um, because of what I have learned from them over the years and what I continue to learn from them about what it means uh, to recognize the right of everybody to have enough to eat, to have a roof over their head. My parents have always um, shown my sister and me uh, such care and support, and have always made sure that we not only have enough to eat, but more than we could possibly imagine. So that kind of boundless generosity and uh, that example of what it means to um, be committed to the well-being of others. That continues to guide me. And both my parents are deeply interested in the arts, in literature, in music. My mom's knowledge of and uh, enthusiasm for the classical and folk traditions of India and Pakistan and Bangladesh that continues to inspire me and to guide my own um, participation in the arts. And my dad is an artist, and I am hoping for the book uh, for my book to use one of his paintings. Um, and he was very generous about right away giving me permission to use his painting um, for my book cover, and so I'm certainly hoping to do this, which will depend on the publisher's approval. And uh, I as I work on uh, the book manuscript. Uh, I find moments, to look at my dad's painting, and that also remains a constant a source of inspiration for me.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Wow, it's great. I mean, family support is such an important point.
Yeah,
So I'm glad to hear that.
yeah. I it's no exaggeration to say that I wouldn't be here without my parents. Like in so many ways. Like I I wouldn't be able to do the work that I do without my parents.
Well, thank you very much for our conversation today. It's really inspiring, and I'm really looking forward to speaking with you again in different contexts because I'm sure we're gonna have some projects again in the future and the common projects, but also reading your book and reading about the progress that will lead to the publication.
Thank you so much, Diane. It's really great to be with you and uh, uh, to explore these ideas and topics of shared interest.
Thank you so much,
Yeah.
and talk soon.
Yes. Talk to you soon.
Bye. Yeah,
Yeah. And I hope that you have a good day ahead.
you too.
Yeah, thanks.
Bye, Stefan.
Okay, bye.